All right, y'all. So I want to get a little geeky with some brain science with you today. Nothing too wild. I want to drop you with 5 quick tips on how ultimately trauma impacts the brain, and then how does that translate into your everyday experience. After I drop you with that knowledge, I'm then going to tell you or share with you ways that you can fix it, correct it, and then bring about permanent change and transformation into your world. All right, so there are 5 major ways that trauma impacts our brain. And I'm going to go through each one step by step, and I'm going to talk about how that shows up every day. I want you to look at it like this. It could be a singular incident or episode. It could have been compounded trauma, meaning you had reoccurring stress, reoccurring incidents, years of adversity, chronic stress. It could be a variety of different ways, but ultimately what we know to be true about trauma and adversity, regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of race, gender, class, etc., trauma lands in the body the same way for everyone across the board. All right, let's start off with the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. It doesn't fucking matter if you remember that name or not. That's irrelevant. What you need to know is that this is the part of the brain that allows you to have self-perception. It's the part of the brain that encourages contemplation when you reflect on goals, strengths, weaknesses. It's your ability to have internalized reflection and really start to entertain thoughts around like, what is this life about? What's the meaning of life, etc. This is also the part of the brain that encourages or cultivates your ability to have self-worth, or your ability to conceptualize self-worth, self-esteem, confidence, etc. And what we know to be true is that trauma disrupts and alters this part of the brain, more specifically if you've had trauma in early childhood. So what this looks like in everyday life is low self-esteem, lack of self-worth, crippling insecurity. So this part of the brain actually works in tandem oftentimes with a lot of our own limiting core beliefs and wounded beliefs, essentially, that we end up developing as a result of experiencing trauma. So they work synergistically. This whole I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, etc., then gets reinforced physiologically by this altered state within our brain, or this altered component of our brain. All right, let's go on to number 2. The amygdala. And this has gotten a lot of hype, rightfully so, because this is the part of the brain that really is centered around your fight or flight response. And this is a really wonderful component of our brain because it's the thing that keeps us safe, ultimately. It's the reptilian part of our brain that dates back to, the beginning of time. So it's what enables us to be able to cope and deal with emergency situations. In the beginning of time, it was like running away from woolly mammoths. And now the challenge is when we have a history of trauma or abuse, right, or chronic stress happening, the amygdala becomes overactive, meaning it's on overdrive all day, every day. So that's kind of like getting in your car and having your pedal to the metal wherever you go. Even when you are driving down side streets or you're parallel parking, you're just completely in overdrive. So naturally, this causes a great deal of challenges in the system, and it puts the body in chronic inflammation. And the way in which it shows up mentally and emotionally in our everyday life is hypervigilance. So chronic fear. It's kind of like that impending doom, just kind of waiting for that next shoe to drop at any point in the game. It also looks like chronic anxiety, being hypervigilant, just kind of always being on guard, irritable, agitated. It's that sense of like something's not right and I'm waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Let's move on to number 3. This is the hippocampus, and this is the part of the brain that really deals with both mood regulation as well as memory consolidation. And so when we have a history of trauma, the hippocampus becomes oftentimes underactive. And so then this creates deficits around both short-term and long-term memory. This can also be responsible for having flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive or obsessive thoughts. The other part about it is that over time, because trauma often leads to chronic anxiety can then impart its way onto really reducing the size of the hippocampus, which in turn causes more alterations in its ability to work effectively. So this shows up in, again, mood dysregulation, kind of being in the world and feeling like you can't cope or you have a lack of emotional resource to deal with stress. All right, moving on to number 4, the insula. This is the part of the brain that helps you tune into your internal experiences, such as noticing when your heart beats faster, or perhaps noticing when you're cold or hungry or thirsty. So it has all that kind of like executive function, which offers insight into what you need both internally and externally to survive and thrive in the world. Post-trauma, individuals tend to have an underactive insula. And so what this looks like is kind of a disconnect from the body. And so this leaves people feeling very unaware of their internal cues in terms of their needs or their essential needs. The way that this oftentimes shows up is that it'll be something as such as checking out, feeling really disconnected from yourself. You'll oftentimes hear people say, not only am I checking out, but I just feel numb. Or there is an element of disassociation, and that's on the extreme, side of the spectrum. We see this a lot with individuals who have a history of sexual abuse or physical abuse. So essentially, these maladaptive behaviors surfaced as a result of being consistently or chronically exposed to a level of abuse that was causing a great deal of harm. So, for example, if I was experiencing reoccurring, sexual abuse, I would start to, in my brain, develop a mechanism to help me check out so that I could still maintain survival in those moments. So although we don't appreciate that it's still showing up in our everyday experiences, there's a reason why it happened, because it helped you survive when those traumas were occurring. So that essentially, in a nutshell, is a maladaptive behavior, a behavior that results or is initiated out of an event that helps you maintain homeostasis. Fast forward 20 years later, it oftentimes still shows up though. And so we will see this in our relationships, for example, in such ways as like checking out during sex, or when you go to have an intimate conversation, you shut down, just feeling really disconnected to your physical body as a whole, like feeling really flighty or airy or spacey, just not having that sense of centeredness and feeling grounded or rooted in the earth. All right, last but not least, number 5, the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the part of the brain that really helps to cope with really, really intense emotions. It also supports you in your kind of problem-solving abilities in terms of making decisions, creating clarity in your life, and just moving through challenges with ease. This part of the brain also becomes underactive. And so the way that this shows up is feeling really torn in terms of, or indecisive, feeling really torn when it comes to figuring out your next best moves, or consistently feeling like on the fence about something. And then also being able to have the ability to regulate really, really intense emotions such as anger or jealousy, depression, despair, grief, all of those really, really intense human expressions. This all plays a really big part in. So not only does it help to regulate the intensity of our emotions, but it also plays a really, really fundamental role in your ability to make decisions and create clarity in your life. And not only just make decisions, but make healthy decisions. All right, so now that we have discussed the 5 most prominent ways that trauma impacts our neurobiology, I want to tell you this. For many of you, you might be thinking, holy shit, what do I do now? I fall into some of those categories. I fall into all of those categories. I'm totally screwed. And that's just simply not the case. So there is light at the end of this tunnel. So you may be impacted by many aspects of the things I just described, and you may have a lot of trauma symptomology present. But I'm going to tell you this, there is no better time than 2021 to either be addicted to something or to be traumatized. And as fucking crazy as that sounds, it's absolutely true. And that is because of the help of neuroplasticity. This is a concept that is relatively new to modern science. Up until about 10 years ago, we thought that our brains were fixed, meaning if you were born into this life with a learning disability, if you had brain trauma, if you had a concussion, if you supposedly did too many drugs and burnt out your brain cells, ultimately you were fucked. And they handed you a little brochure and maybe some programming, but ultimately you were expected to live a life of limitation. We now know that's simply not true. And that in fact, not only is the brain malleable and not fixed, but it is actually wired for healing. So for many of you who are wondering, what the hell do I do? I've been in therapy. I have read every self-help book. I've drank a shit ton of ayahuasca, whatever. Ultimately, what you need to do is get your physiology and your biology on board to work for you instead of against you. So you could do all the things, right? You could see the best doctors. You could be on the best medication. You could be engaging in therapy year after year. But if you don't learn how to correct some of the things that we discussed in terms of your neurobiological response and your physiological response to your thoughts, to your behaviors, you never really get to carry out permanent change. So one of the best ways that you can start really initiating the process of healing is to start taking a look at the ways in which you can deactivate that fight or flight response and engage in activities that help you bring you back into your body, help you regulate your moods, as well as cultivate a lifestyle that supports the regulation and the correction of your nervous system and ultimately your neurobiology over time. Once you can get your biology on board, all that other extra stuff that you do, all those other modalities around psychology and integration work can now start to come together and actually be effective long term. This may require hiring a therapist who's got clinical expertise in trauma, maybe a coach, maybe accessing group support. I also run a program, a 10-week program called Life Camp with Miss Ruby Christine, and together we co-facilitate a transformational trauma-informed program that really addresses not only the neurobiological and physiological responses that trauma has, and we help you cultivate a new biological landscape, but we also feed you some really dope cutting-edge content that works in tandem with these physiological exercises that we give you to help bring about change and permanent transformation. So again, whether you work with me or anybody else, the objective is to get your physiology on board to be working for you instead of against you. Post-trauma, we have physiology and biology that oftentimes works against us and not in our favor, and it keeps us stuck in patterns and ways of thinking and being in the world that ultimately don't serve us. So I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned a few things. If you have any questions, throw the comments below.